Greetings. I got a little smile on my face. The Syracuse University football team is now 6-0. Beat North Carolina State 24-9 today. And it's the first time they've been at 6-0 since 1987. That team went all the way through the season going 11-0 before they had a shot at the national championship, and they had a tie in the last game. And it turns out there's only 3 teams in Syracuse football history that started the season 6-0. Not even the national championship team did that. Syracuse won the national championship back in 1959, and they had a tie somewhere along the way, but then they went down south, beat a southern team. I don't even care which one it is. I think I know which one, but I don't want to say the wrong team because I may get that wrong. But still, that's a big deal for us. So I'm happy that I'm wearing my Syracuse shirt. Here's the thing. If someone came to me and asked who was the best football player in Syracuse football history, I would say, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people might say Jim Brown. Jim Brown is possibly the greatest athlete who ever came to Syracuse. I mean, he was in 3 sports, and he lettered in all 3 sports. So you could say Jim Brown. You could say Ernie Davis, who's the only player from Syracuse football who ever won the Heisman Trophy. You could say Donovan McNabb because he quarterbacked the Philadelphia Eagles and took them to a Super Bowl. Didn't win it, but still, he did that. And they had some wonderful teams when he was quarterback. But if someone asked me who my favorite player was of all time, it would be Don McPherson. Don McPherson was the quarterback of the team where Syracuse basically went 11-0-1. They had a tie in one of those bowl games, which ended up leaving them ranked at number 4 when they still had a chance at the national championship. And he turns out to be the only Syracuse player who finished second in the Heisman Trophy to Tim Brown. Okay, it's hard to be mad at that, but still, it was pretty cool. That's my favorite player. Here's the thing about favorites. Favorites usually happen sometime in a time period where you actually got to see them play a lot. So, for instance, I could go to basketball. Basketball is interesting because there's a lot of talk that you hear pundits do this all the time. You hear different players, different times when they're interviewed, and they'll be asked either one of 2 questions. Who is on your Mount Rushmore, or who are your top 5 players, or top 3, something like that. Truth of the matter is, that's a hard thing to answer because every era is different. And if you really want to compare someone to a different era, you have to try to say, okay, what was different about those time periods? For instance, my favorite basketball player of all time is Wilt Chamberlain. To me, Wilt Chamberlain is the greatest basketball player. Now, some will say, well, wait a minute. What about Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan won 6 titles. You know, just because you won 6 titles doesn't necessarily mean you're the best. The thing about Wilt Chamberlain is he scored 100 points in a game. He scored 78 points in another game. He averaged over 50 points a game. Now, some people will say, yeah, but look at the people he was playing against back then. Well, let's look at that. I mean, a lot of those guys are Hall of Famers, and you're going to say, yeah, but there's no yeah, but. They're Hall of Famers. And Wilt Chamberlain once talked to Michael Jordan about this, and Michael Jordan said, you know, all the rules that they have these days, you know, I get to do all this stuff. And Wilt Chamberlain said they changed rules so that I couldn't be as dominant. And I was still dominant. It's an interesting question. But Wilt Chamberlain is my favorite basketball player. That doesn't mean that I diminish what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did. It doesn't mean I diminish what Michael, Lord have mercy. Well, I will say Michael Jordan. It doesn't diminish what Magic Johnson did. It doesn't diminish what Kobe Bryant did. It doesn't diminish what Shaq did. And it certainly doesn't diminish what LeBron James has done. LeBron James is my favorite player right now. But if someone came to me and said, is he in your top 5 of all time? I don't know because there's been so many players. I could sit down right now. Actually, I'm sitting down, so I guess I could. But I could name 20 players who I think would be in the top 20. But to limit it to top 5 all time, whew, that's a tough one. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I think that it gets kind of hard when people are asked to name who their favorites are or they're the top, who are the best. Because sometimes your best is not your favorite. For instance, Atlanta Hawks had a guy named Dominique Wilkins. The dude was magical. He did stuff that no one else could do back at that time. People in Atlanta, because that's who he played for. People in Atlanta, there's probably a bunch of people who will say he is their favorite player of all time. He's the best player of all time. But he played in an era where his team was never all that good. So he had to compete against Michael Jordan. He had to compete against Magic Johnson. He had to compete against the Detroit Pistons teams. It's hard to get things like that. And, I did a video a couple weeks ago where I talked about Michael Jackson. I said Michael Jackson is my favorite of all times. Now, truthfully, I will also say Michael Jackson is the greatest of all times. But, Michael Jackson and I were only a year apart. There are a whole lot of musicians who followed Michael Jackson or were contemporaries of Michael Jackson who were really, really good, who I loved listening to their music. I would go to their concerts. These days, you know what? I don't think I know Lizzo. Lizzo's the only new artist I know. I don't know anybody else. I've heard some names. I've heard of Cardi B. I've heard of Megan Thee Stallion. I think that's the name. I've heard of some other people. I've heard of them, but I've never heard their music because, I like the music that I liked, older music. My favorite music pretty much goes up through probably the early 90s. When I liked dance music, that was my period of time. When I liked ballads, that was my favorite time. When I liked rap, 80s to the early 90s, that was my time. After that, I don't know anybody. Does that necessarily mean that if someone came to me and said, well, so you're saying that the greatest people of all times, the top people of all times, were all way back then? Well, I might, but I don't know because I can't compare them to any of the people that they're doing now. And it doesn't have to be me. It doesn't disparage anyone if you decide to tell people who your favorites are. It doesn't diminish anyone if you tell them who your top 4 or 5 are. But you will start to find out if you really had to name your top 3 people, you probably couldn't do it. Because you're going to sit there, just like these people who are asked, okay, who are the top 3 basketball players? Who are the top 3 baseball players? Who are the top 3 football players of all time? You may have number 1 who might be your favorite. It's possible you have a number 2. But then those others, you're going, God, it could be this person. It could be this person. Oh, geez, I'm not really sure how to put it in there. Boy, that's a tough question. And it is. Just enjoy what you want to enjoy. Have your favorites. Like I said, Michael Jackson is my favorite. Don McPherson is my favorite Syracuse University player. Wilt Chamberlain is my favorite basketball player. Roberto Clemente is my favorite baseball player. I don't really have a favorite football player. I know that sounds weird, but I don't. I have a favorite hockey player, and I haven't really watched a lot of hockey except for local teams in a longest time. But it would have been Bobby Orr back in the early 70s. If I had to say who my favorite soccer player was, it would be Pele. Polo. It would be Pele. He's from way back in the 60s, but he also played in the 70s. But I can't name any other soccer players. Well, there's one. I think, is David Beckham the one who's married to a former Spice Girl? If it is, then there's 2. It's not a sport I keep up with. It's just one of those kind of things where I think that when people are asked who they think the greatest are, they tend to name their favorites. And there's nothing wrong with having a whole bunch of favorites, especially as you get older. Yeah, I may not be able to tell you the names of any musicians. I may not be able to tell you the name of almost any actors who aren't Marvel actors. For the past 20 years, I may struggle with that, but it doesn't mean I didn't enjoy what they did. I just don't really remember all the names because it wasn't a thing I needed to know. I could look it up, I could find out, and I might do that on certain occasions, but in general, we're good. And you're good. Depends, Who are your favorites, if you want to mention? I don't know if you want to try to decide who your top 5 are in any industry whatsoever, because you're going to find that's a hard one to do. However, I did do a video some months ago where I talked about what 5 people would you like to invite to dinner. And I still think that's valid, because it may not be all your favorite people. It may be people who you think you would like to gain some knowledge from, or who you'd like to learn from, or who you'd like to hear about their stories. Think about that. Anyway, that's what I have tonight. My name is Mitch Mitchell. I guess I'm supposed to ask you to like the video, please, and to subscribe, please. I'll leave that up to you. Y'all take care.